Aaron McRae and Chris Spence. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are all participating today from traditional territories across Canada, or perhaps even further. And I myself am joining from Treaty 6 territory. And Treaty 6 territory encompasses the territories of numerous First Nations, including the Cree, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, Ojibwe, and the homeland of the Métis. So I would pay my respects to our ancestors of these lands and ask that each of us take this moment to reaffirm our relationship with these lands and with one another. And we've got a pretty full slate today, so I'm really pleased to see so many of you joining us today. We're going to take an approach that has the first portion dedicated to some talks by researchers from GWF, sharing some of their results. And then we're going to use the latter part of the time today to have more of a focused discussion around the mobilization of research for policy needs. And so we have a number of panelists who will join and share their thoughts, and we'll have time for a few questions for our panel as well. Unfortunately, our first speaker today wasn't able to join us live. They're currently in China, and so the time difference just made it impossible, but they were able to record a presentation. And so we'll start by sharing this presentation from Ying Zhao from the University of Saskatchewan, and then we will move on to the speakers who are with us in person today.
Thanks to the organizing committee. Good morning, everyone.
Is the audio working okay, everyone?
I'm Zhao Ying. Thanks to the organizing committee to give me this opportunity for the presentation. The title is When Agrohydrology Meets Critical Zone Size, New Progress and Perspectives. We first give a brief history of the agrohydrology to ensure confirmation of the basic concept and a short introduction of CZ and its implications in agrohydrology, whereby a new area of CZ agrohydrology is proposed. To address a multidisciplinary leadership, we also introduce other similar disciplines. Afterward, we present the key research priorities and further give an outlook for future applications of CZ agrohydrology in the model agriculture. Agrohydrology is a research field that transcends the traditional area of agronomy, irrigation engineering, and hydrology to integrate water resources management, crop water productivity, soil fertility, and land management at all scales in the hydrophysical system. Traditionally, knowledge of hydrology has been well applied in the irrigation, dryland, and paddy rice agriculture. For example, in the dry area of Chinese North Plateau, the impact of multi-cultivation and soil amendment of coupled soil water and heat movement has been well investigated. Like here, a typical ridge cultivation with plastic film multi-system has been well proved. Notably different from previous special study of geoscience. For example, weather zone, the critical zone size viewed the outer space of the terrestrial Earth, where rock meet life as a united system, both in vertical dimension from the base of active groundwater circulation through the top of the vegetation canopies, and in horizontal dimension in compactly nested catchment associated with the surface and subsurface structure that develop all geological time scales. This science offers multidisciplinary research opportunities through an evolutionary mapping monitoring modeling framework for CZ properties, structure, process, and service. Such an evolutionary approach allows the development of an adaptive strategy and refined models and monitoring network as knowledge and database is accumulated. For instance, the hydrology of landscape reflects the underlying spatial soil structure and landform characteristics. The coupled above ground and below ground systems can improve our understanding of how water in subsurface and surface are leaked. In this perspective, field hydrologic investigation of processes, structure, and function is particularly unified from the surface, shallow, and deep subsurface across different spatial scales by CZ studies. Therefore, the emerging concept of the critical zone size can be introduced to boost the integration of agrohydrological theories and approaches. The word cloud analysis indicates hydrology and ecohydrology are an essential part of agrohydrology, with its keywords include structure, root, water, and organic. At the same time, agriculture and hydropedagogy are integral part of the critical zone, with their keywords heavy flow, scale, heat, process, and model. Currently, the development of agrohydrological theory and integrated approaches is very limited, along with the lack of coordination among other hydrological subdisciplines. For example, agrometeorology, ecohydrology, hydrogeology, and hydropedagogy. We therefore advocate a new research scope of CZ agrohydrology to embrace the transdisciplinary nature of water-based research. Different from conventional agrohydrology that is often based on water-related research with agriculture science, ecology, and society science, CZ agrohydrology emphasizes in-situ water transport in soil, plant, atmosphere continuum system across spatial, temporal, agricultural dimensions and scales, which have distinct hydrological features and vary environmental settings, thus providing a more realistic and integrated understanding of real-world agricultural water use processes. Here we basically ask the three questions. How does the CZ agrohydrology respond to climate and human disturbance? Second, what controls the CZ agrohydrology properties and processes? Thirdly, how can we use our advanced understanding of CZ agrohydrology to benefit society need. In this regard, we want to use the conception of three deeps to stimulate three key research priorities of CZ agrohydrology. Certainly, integrated method for multifunctional quantitative landscape assessment, planning, and management could be derived from an increased focus on functionally oriented critical science with appropriate consideration of deep depth, deep time, and deep complexity. Deep time emphasizes the leaky past CZ evolution to current CZ functions to future CZ scenarios. One of the most useful tools is stable isotope tracing. This can be well outlined in the WEF nexus: water allocation, water color, water age, and water locations. Depth provides a historic view of the entire three-dimensional CZ as a unified system. For instance, based on soil water dynamics, certain hydrology model that can simulate the upward capillary rise water has limitations for the requirement of large amount of spatial very input data and parameters. This required a well-development of physically based distributed hydrological model. Deep complexity indicates the complex interplay of CZ processes and suggests the need to link service to management. In this regard, the seed theory application in the G-spec system would provide lower insight into how plants regulate hydrological collectivity from the subsurface to the atmosphere, regardless of locations, seasons, and biome. To the previous three deeps for the applications, we also suggest another deep practices, which should have and will be widely applied in the modern agriculture, such as precision agriculture and climate and water smart agriculture. Due to the advancement in technology and reduction in size, sensors and their network become involved in agriculture. The advent of wireless sensor network has significantly advanced intelligent agriculture. Further considerable improvement is expected to use the Internet of Things to achieve improved monitoring and control of irrigation farming. Thank you for your attention.
All right. So thanks to Ying for that first talk. And as I stated at the top, I know a few people have joined us late. He was unable to join due to time zone difference, but we'll move quickly into the next presentation from Juha He at the University of Saskatchewan. And you'll see some prompts in the chat starting to appear about questions. So we'll try to fit in questions for our speakers if we can, and if not, we'll ask them to answer those in the chat after their talks are done. All right, Juha, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to share my screen. I guess you guys could see my screen well, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Today I'm going to share our work on the sensitivity of Canadian Prairie's Pothole Basin hydrology to climate change. And this is a group work with contributions from John Pomeroy and Karen Shook and Chris Spence and also Colin. And it is a part of the Prairie Water Project. So to do the sensitivity analysis, we divided the Canadian prairies into several classes based on the climate and the geological, topographical, and landform characteristics. And more details about the classification could be found in GWF's paper published in 2019 on his. Today, I'm going to take the Pothole Till PhD as an example to show the sensitivities. And we are forcing our hydrological model using the meteorological observation from 4 stations, including the Ross Bedford station in the Ross, and the Estive in the south, and Yorkton and Brandon in the east. The objectives of this work are to investigate how sensitive are the slow and the runoff processes to temperature and precipitation changes in the prairies, and what are the influence of changes in slow processes on the runoff duration. We are using the CRIN model, called the region hydrological model, as a tool to investigate the sensitivities. And we are forcing the model with 7 temperature input scenarios, including the reference observation in the period of 1916 to 2004, and 6 climate warming scenarios with an increment of 1 degree. And also by 5 precipitation input scenarios, including a reference observation in the modern period, and 1 decrease scenario and 3 increase scenarios. These climate scenarios in general develop the potential climate change ranges until the end of this century in the prairies. We are using a virtual basin model approach to represent the hundreds of similar Pothole Till basins in the class. And this slide shows the HIUs used in the model to represent the most common land covers in the Pothole Till class. They include cropland, grassland, forest, shrubland, and fallow in the upstream, and also wetlands and trail in the downstreams. All the HIUs were characterized by different depression of water storage capacities. And so the depressions can be fully filled or partly filled or even empty in the model simulations. These results indicate that the annual snowfall and the runoff decrease with the temperature warming and increase with the precipitation increase. And these 2 variables show somehow different sensitivities to the climate changes on the 4 stations because of the local climate difference. And on average, the snowfall will decrease by about 8 millimeter per degree warming, and increase by about 50 millimeter by per 10% increase of the precipitation. And relatively, the annual runoff show a much smaller sensitivity to temperature warming, but a close or similar sensitivity to temperature to the precipitation increase. As we can see, the precipitation and temperature show inverse impacts on the slow and the runoff. So we are wondering how about the combined effects of precipitation and temperature changes. So this slide shows that the reduction of snowfall caused by temperature warming can be partly compensated by the increase caused by precipitation increases. For example, the reduction of snowfall caused by two temperature warming can be compensated by the increase caused by precipitation increase about 12% to 60% on the 4 stations. And similarly, we can see that the reduction of runoff caused by temperature warming of 2 degrees can be compensated by the increase caused by precipitation increase about 2% to 8%, 11% on the 2 or 4 stations. We can the reduced snowfall ratio in precipitation can have stronger influence on the runoff generation. For example, the ratio between streamflow at the basin outlet and the precipitation input, as well as the ratio between the surface runoff in the field set and the precipitation input are positively related to the snowfall ratio in the precipitation. That is because the reduced snowfall ratio caused by temperature warming will result in increased infiltration and much higher evapotranspiration loss in the precipitation. Beyond that, the connected area is another important issue for the runoff generation in the prairies, which refers to the basin area that are connected to the channel and can contribute to any runoff generated to the basin outlet. So these slides show how the connecting area was calculated in the model simulations based on the simulated depletion water storage in the different HRUs. So in general, there are 4 scenarios for the connecting areas. Firstly, all the HRUs from the uplands to the downstream wetlands were fully filled. So in these cases, all these HRUs were considered as connected to the basin channel. And secondly, only the wetland HRUs were fully filled. So in these cases, only the wetland HRUs were considered as a connecting area to the channel. And thirdly, only the bottom wetland HRUs were fully filled, but the top wetlands were only partly filled. So in these cases, only the bottom wetland HRUs were considered as connected to the channel. And also in the last cases, they are possibly only the they are possibly that the bottom wetland HRUs were partly filled, but the top wetland were fully filled. But in this case, there would be no connecting area to the channel. So this slide shows that calculated connected area is also sensitive to the temperature warming. For example, in the Brandon stations, in this figure, the blue line refers to the mean daily stream flow, and the black line refers to the mean daily connected area in the simulations. So we can see a decrease of the connected area fraction with the temperature warming. And also we can see a good consistency between the runoff timing and the connecting area timing, which means in the piers there is no connecting area in the basin. It's possible there are no stream flow at the basin outlet. And similarly, we can see the good consistency between the slow melt timing and the connecting area timing. In this figure, the red lines refer to the mean snowpack in the basin. So the reduction of the snowpack indicates snow melting. So we can see the snow melting timing is consistent with the rising timing of the connecting area. And then we can also see the consistency between the peak snowpack volume and also the maximum connecting area percentage in the basin. So So yeah, here are our summary of this work. So we can see a stronger sensitivity of the slope processes to the climate change, and the slope ratio will decline from 0.32 in the current to about the 0.2 with the temperature warming of 6 degrees. And the reduced slope ratio and the temperature warming will result in a less surface runoff and a greater infiltration and higher evapotranspiration loss in the precipitation. And the reductions are in the peak snowpack volume due to temperature warming will lead to a smaller connecting area flexion in the basin. And the connecting timing is strongly related to the snowmelt timing in spring, and which is essential for the runoff duration at the basin outlet. Okay, thanks everyone for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jiwa. And I'm just going to ask that if you have any questions for Jiwa, that you use the chat so that we can try to keep on time and leave enough room for our panel discussion at the end. So with that, I would ask Philip Harder from the University of Saskatchewan to join us and share your presentation with us.
Can I share my screen? Okay, there we go. Right. Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon or more lunchtime for others in Saskatchewan. But I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing on understanding crop growth under persistent water limitations, specifically in the Canadian prairies, and using a water balance approach. So don't need much reminding probably to this audience, but the Canadian prairies are a very large agricultural domain. And annually, we're managing about 25 million hectares of this ecozone, or 50% of it, through agricultural practices. Because this is a semi-arid climate, water availability is going to always be this major limitation for crop growth. And as we move to a time when we are talking about climate change and the uncertainties around that, we really need to have more water balance type observations that capture seasonal crop growth dynamics to really understand some of the risks that we might be dealing with. But these observations tend to be scarce. And a challenge that we're on top of all of this is that nothing is static in this system. Agriculture by itself is incredibly adaptive. So the figure on the right, if you see the yield, it's increased more than double in the last 100 years, despite really not a huge change in precipitation. And this is just changes in crop breeding, agricultural practices. And so what does it look like in the future? We might be talking about higher temperatures, more precipitation, but what will these responses be in addition to what is agriculture going to look like in the future? So we've taken a much more observation-based approach to this. So we've collected 16 site years of data from sites near Saskatoon. And all of these sites were measuring all components of energy and water balance during the growing season, using radiation sensors, eddy covariance for our turbulent fluxes, heat fluxes, soil moisture, lots of precipitation observations, and doing a lot of QA, QC on our eddy covariance data to get some good quality data. So what does this data really tell us? And so we'll start off by looking at some of the crop water usage or growing season evapotranspiration. And we can see that there is a huge range in variability in this. For example, peas, in the figure on the right, it's days since the start of seeding or start of the growing season, and it's cumulative evapotranspiration. So peas, they can be as little as 100 millimeters of water usage in the growing season, in this case 2018, or we can get up towards 300 millimeters for our wheats and our forages. To put this in context, a lot of our crop water usage has often been informed by potential evapotranspiration equations, and these are much larger because they're not limited by the water that's available, for example. So if we put this in terms of a water balance on the prairies, we can make a lot of assumptions, especially in the site years that we're looking at, where basically evapotranspiration for the growing season or the crop water usage is equal to rainfall plus the change in soil moisture. And looking at the figures on the right, red is the evaporation, crop water usage in the column on the left, and the column on the right is rainfall and the soil moisture change. This is not a perfect water balance closure. There are definitely gaps in some of these areas, but considering the spatial variability of the observations and their mismatches, we're doing a fairly good job at this. And what it shows is that really rainfall is consistently a dominant water source, obviously. What's more interesting though is the soil moisture. And so the soil moisture that goes into growing our crops is generally coming from our snowmelt water infiltration in the springtime. And it's really quite a variable source. In some years, peas in 2018, it represented 45% of the water usage versus lentils in 2015, where there was no change in the soil moisture status. To put this in sort of context a little bit more seasonally, we have data from our Keniston location where we have continuous observations from 2016 to 2020. So we can disaggregate our water balance into spring, winter, spring, and summer terms. So winter being the start of the water year until the end of snowmelt, spring being from snowmelt to the start of the growing season, and then summer being growing season to the end of the water year. There's a lot going on here, and it's a complex story, but really what this is re-emphasizing is that we have in wintertime, the wintertime process, we have snowfall, we have sublimation, then we have runoff and meltwater infiltration. Generally, we have an increase in soil moisture at the end of our winter. It can be large or it can be negligible, but generally it's going to be a positive increase to our moisture status. Springtime, it's a very dynamic season and short, so there's a lot of variability in that, which we won't get into. And then our growing season, once again, this is showing our very high evapotranspiration terms, but also a consistent usage of that soil moisture. So this is not necessarily new information, but we are able to quantify this in terms of a water balance and really come up and understand sort of the relative terms that we're dealing with. But to dial a little bit more into that soil moisture, what this data is showing, once again, is that soil moisture is what's buffering our crop water demand in our dry conditions. The figure on the right, on the x-axis, we've got our standardized precipitation index. It's an index that indicates if we're, wet or dry conditions. And then we have soil moisture change on the y-axis. And we can see very clearly that in dry conditions, we see a lot of soil moisture usage by our crops. There's variability in that amount of usage that really depends on differences in our crop types and how much of the root zone is being accessed, because they all have different rooting depths. And also does reflect that we have interannual differences in snow accumulation, meltwater partitioning. At the end of the day, what this is really reiterating, though, is that we need to have good soil moisture conservation practices. This was a big thing, obviously, in the 60s and 70s. We've moved on to other things to improve our production, but we really need to go back to this if we want to build resiliency into our system. And we really need to, along those lines, think about re-examining our snow management practices. So this is where we can leave tall stubble behind in a field to reduce sublimation, increase the trapping of snow in the stubble, so that come springtime, there's more snow that is able to infiltrate. This was all sort of done. Initial work was done when we were talking about zero tillage adoption, but things have changed since then, from the 80s to current practices. So we need to think a little bit more about what role our practices have. But what about the future? So we've talked a lot about the observations here, but what about the future? So we've got a model that we've been running. This is all preliminary work, but the AquaCrop OS. It's the crop model that can simulate crop growth and water usage. And we're starting to get some results out of this and showing some promise. Blue is observed, red is our model, and this is our biomass. So we're able to say, simulate our biomass, how much our crops are able to actually produce. In terms of evapotranspiration, cumulatively, we're doing pretty good. This is once again preliminary work, so we still need to fine tune things, but we are showing that we can represent evapotranspiration. What if we want to tweak this to consider the future? So, for example, let's just increase our air temperature by 2.5 degrees. This is a water limited system, so we're not going to transpirate really anything more. But what is interesting is the dynamic that develops in terms of with warmer conditions, our crops are able to grow earlier and faster based on our growing degree day demands. And this will lead to earlier and higher higher ET rates at the beginning of the season, and it leads to a lower overall growing season length, which leads to a decrease in the cumulative crop water usage that we're able to see. This is all still early work. And I just wanted to stress that our further work is really going to look at moisture and heat stresses and the vulnerabilities that might show up there in terms of production with climate change. So in summary, crop growth on the Canadian prairies is generally water limited. We do have periods of wet, but historically it's an area that is dry, and conditions tend to always be on the edge. Right now we're looking at a drought situation, and who knows how that will manifest in the next little while. Soil moisture recharge from snowmelt, it's this buffer to our crop water demand that really will get us through dry conditions. And so if we want to increase resiliency in our agriculture, we need to start thinking a little bit more again at improving ag outcomes with the snow management principles. And there's a little bit of our early work is showing this compensatory crop growth water use response to increasing temperatures. To really get a good handle on that, we need to do a more complete description of this in a modeling sense in terms of applying coupling growing season models and snow hydrology models like the ones that Jihao just was talking about. So I will leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Philip. Really nice to see the work you've been taking on, and I will ask Qian Liu to get ready with your presentation. And again, if you guys have questions for our speakers, we'll try to perhaps cover a couple of questions at the end, but they also could answer questions to the chat in order that we can try to keep on schedule here. So happy to have you join us, Qian, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Colin, and hello, everyone. So today I will talk about phosphorus runoff from Canadian agricultural land. So this work is based on a paper that I have written with Jane Elliott, Henry Wilson, Marion Macri, Helen Bosch, and David Laub. Okay, so water eutrophication is a big problem across Canada. For example, both Lake Winnipeg in the west and Lake Erie in the east have been experiencing severe water eutrophication problems. And the frequency and magnitude of algal blooms have actually increased in the recent decades. For example, in 2011, Lake Erie experienced an algal bloom of record-setting magnitude. And in Lake Winnipeg in 2013, it was named as the threatened lake of the year. And in 2015, actually the algal bloom in the Lake Erie break its own record. So this really suggests we need to do something to mitigate these lake eutrophication problems. And the phosphorus is believed to be the limiting factor for freshwater ecosystems, and agriculture has been identified as the dominant source of phosphorus loads to both of these lakes and many other lakes. So that means we should pay attention to manage phosphorus losses from the agricultural land. So almost all Canada belongs to the cold climate region, as shown in this map. And the cold climates are defined as the regions that have an average temperature above 10 degrees in their warmest months and average below -3 degrees in the coldest months. So in cold climate regions, surface runoff, or maybe generally just a runoff, is driven by both rainfall and snow melt. And so in the cold regions, the growing seasons are very short, and so the uptake of nutrients by the crops is limited. And also when the soil is frozen, the water infiltration is limited. So this would promote the runoff volume. And also vegetation can be a source of nutrient losses. And also there are like winter applications of nutrients, especially manure, and that also can contribute to nutrient losses. So this make very severe nutrient losses problem in cold agricultural regions. So although both Western Canada and Eastern Canada belong to cold climate regions, annual precipitation differs greatly across these regions. And also the cropping systems are different in these regions. So a question is if Western Canada and Eastern Canada have the same phosphorus runoff patterns, and what are the drivers for those runoff patterns? So we have conducted a synthesis study across Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. So in this study, we collected data that was monitored by Jane, Mary, and Henry for 216 site years. And so Saskatchewan has a semi-arid climate, and Manitoba has a sub-humid continental climate, and Ontario has a humid continental climate. So we tried to cover all these climate gradients, and for each province, we had multiple sites and years, and there were different cropping systems like annual crops, perennial crops, and different tillage systems. And all runoff data were collected surface runoff, but in Ontario, Marion's group also measured tile flow and phosphorus losses in tile drainage. So I will just show some results. So these two figures showed the runoff depth patterns in all these regions, and in these figures, S stands for snow and R stands for rain, and A is annual. So, and each data point represents one set year. So basically, these results show that runoff depth varied with the site years and regions, and we can say that on average, Ontario had more runoff than Manitoba than Saskatchewan. And in most cases, annual runoff was dominated by snow melt in all regions, as shown in this figure on the right. And these are the results for total P loads. So basically, it showed again that total P load varied with the site years and regions. We can say there's a large variability in these figures. But in general, mean annual P loads were in a relatively small range. They were in all 8 regions. They were all below 1 kilogram per hectare per year. And in most cases, annual total P load was dominated by snow melt in all regions. This was just like the pattern of the runoff depth. So we also analyzed the patterns of flow-weighted dissolved P concentrations. Basically, it showed that dissolved P concentrations, again, it's not surprising, but it is varied with the site years and regions, and specifically Saskatchewan and Manitoba had, in general, higher mean dissolved P concentrations than Ontario. This was possibly because the runoff volume was low in the prairies. And in general, dissolved P was the main P form in both snow melt and rainfall runoff in Manitoba, as that is shown in this cluster on this figure on the right. But particulate P was the major P form in Ontario. And so remember that Ontario has the tile flow, which dominated the annual total flow. So that may be the reason why particulate P dominated the total P loss. It might be just because the dissolved P in the drainage was filtered by the soil particles. And we found that runoff depth increased significantly with the increasing precipitation inputs for both snowmelt runoff and rainfall runoff. And also total P loads increased with the increasing precipitation inputs. Also, we found that dissolved P concentrations increased with the soil ozone P concentrations in Manitoba, as shown for both rainfall runoff and snowmelt runoff in these two figures. But we didn't find the same trend for Ontario. That might be partly because for Ontario, we had a very few data points. And also the general trend looked different between Ontario and Manitoba. Again, Manitoba had much higher dissolved P concentrations in runoff, but Ontario has much lower concentrations. That is probably because the subsurface transport of phosphorus, the concentration was reduced. Okay, so finally, I have some implications of this work on water quality monitoring and management. So first of all, we realized from this work, we realized that in different regions, like the different researchers use the different methods and the treatments also differed. So it would be good to have a coordinated monitoring program for future research to just to standardize the methods and also to test the same treatments, so we could obtain information that could be useful for different regions. And the differing dominant P forms in Western and Eastern Canada suggests there's a need to use different types of beneficial management practices to reduce phosphorus losses. And also, we should be aware that local conditions need to be considered when adopting beneficial management practices, because one practice that may work in Ontario that doesn't necessarily work in the prairies. So we should build a research based on local realities. And also, soil phosphorus is important, as most of the P runoff occurs during non-growing seasons, and during this time period, there are fewer options that are available for reduced nutrient losses. Okay, with that, I thanks everyone for your attention.
Thanks very much, Gian, for your presentation. And yeah, we're tight on time, so I'll encourage any questions to come via the Q&A window that you have available to you. I see a few questions have come through there, so that's great to engage our speakers this way. So thank you, Gian, again, and I am happy to call on our final presenter, Emily Cavalier, to share her research with us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Cavalier. I'm a postdoc with in University of Saskatchewan and the Global Institute for Water Security. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about an approach for assessing changes to ecosystem services using integrated models of hydrology, biogeochemistry, and biodiversity when wetlands are drained. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. I'm also presenting this work on behalf of many. It was an interdisciplinary team that made this work. I'd also like to acknowledge my funding sources. So just a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. Juha kind of hit on this, but a reminder of what the virtual basin approach is and how I'm going to be using it to assess ecosystem services. Some of the preliminary findings for the cold regions hydrological model on wetland drainage and use of hydrology, these hydrology outputs in other models, and some preliminary findings. So the prairies are a mosaic of landscapes. Across the 3 prairie provinces, they have different management strategies. They go through wet and dry cycles, as Philip alluded to, high degree of interannual variability, and they're critical habitat for wildlife, as well as being naturally nutrient rich. This leads to a not so homogeneous landscape. This is work that was done by Wolf et al. In 2019, showing just kind of how we can classify the prairies into basically 7 different watershed classes based off their functionality and how they might respond to hydrological change. So using that approach, the classification to understand ecosystem services, it's a tool to understand land use changes, in this case drainage, and how drainage scenarios might impact the unique hydrology of the prairies, and again, assess ecosystem services at the small scale rather than large scale. The virtual basin approach basically uses a base scenario of 0% drainage at max depressional water storage over a 30-year period. And we put in multiple different drainage scenarios, draining some wetlands from small to large to small, top to bottom, and bottom to top. Today, I'm going to be focusing just on the small to large drainage scenario. And then the number and size distribution of wetlands within this virtual basin match the watershed class. And in this case, it's going to be a pothole till, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. We're using 100 kilometers squared as the resolution because that's the closest we can get to the level of decision being made by individual landowners. And then we're also using climate forcing. So, the pothole till region is a wide region. It encompasses all 3 provinces. So looking at how we can understand these changes under different climate patterns, and these are just all historical. There's no future trends here. So using the CRIM outputs, I've been modified to estimate ecosystem services, using the basin outflow from this virtual basin to estimate nutrient loading, and the wetland areas used to estimate biodiversity and water storage. So the CRIM, Cold Regions Hydrological model, uses hydrological response units and basically has a flat pancake at uniform depth of water. And I had to modify that using the Hayashi-Vanderkamp relationship to get something that looked more like a wetland and what we could translate into some of the models we use. So I converted that to wetland pond area to estimate kind of what it would look like on a landscape. And then I took these and I'm using them to estimate ecosystem services. These are all the ones we're looking at, but the ones in blue, water storage, bird abundance, and nutrient loading are the ones I'm presenting on today. So prairie water storage, wetlands add to a basin storage capacity, and drainage influences the flood frequency and severity, and that's often dependent on precipitation and climate, the structure of the basin, and the nature of the drainage. And prairie biodiversity, we know that the prairie region is a hotspot for biodiversity, and we get the most biodiversity when wetland sizes and classes are heterogeneous. So there's a variety, a mix of them. And drainage causes a homogeneous kind of wetland size and class, which is not great and has led to historically loss of habitat. Nutrient loading. So we predict that with drainage, we're going to see an increase in volume flow, and that's expected to lead to an increase in nutrient loading through increased soil erosion and nutrient transport. There's a high degree of interannual variability in nutrients loading, most pronounced in wet periods with little or no effect in dry periods. sorry. I get just distracted by the chat. Most pronounced in wet periods with little effect on dry periods. Wetlands can contribute to nutrient and sediment retention. So some of the pothole till results. So that's the light blue region on this map. And as I said, it spans quite a large region. These are some of the virtual basin results for pothole till. Then the amount drained is on the x-axis and the annual discharge is on the y. And basically what we're seeing is a largely linear increase in discharge with increasing percent drainage. Oh, by the way, there's the different types of drainage as the columns and the different locations as rows here. Most of the differences we see are due to these climate forcings and the differences in climate drainage scenarios. And today I'm mostly focusing on Yorkton, climate forcing and the small to large drainage scenario. And that does show the linear increase with increasing drainage. So some results, again, changes in annual flow for pothole till. Annual flow volumes affected even when drainage is low, and average flows tend to have higher impacts due to drainage. And we know that interannual variability and where wetlands are lost are likely important. So those gatekeeper wetlands. So some of the results that I've presented here, annual wetland pond area for pothole till. So on the left figure, there's wetland loss on the X and pond area on the Y. And you can see that as wetlands are lost, we actually increase the individual pond areas. So these wetlands are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. While on the right figure, we have wetland loss on the X and then total pond area as a summation of the whole we're losing because we are draining those individual wetlands. So the total area is actually decreasing. So what that means is that the maximum storage for pothole till is also changing. So with wetland loss, again, that on the x-axis and wetland storage on the y, we can see that there's a proportional decrease in the amount of water stored in this virtual basin as the wetlands are drained. Other drainage scenarios might also show different trends. Again, we talking about the interannual variability and those gatekeeper wetlands. So the pond area was also used as a proxy for bird abundance using work done by Bob Clark. So using these as a proxy, again, it excludes most bird species, but we can see that there's actually, it's not as a linear decrease in bird abundance. So again, on the y-axis is the bird abundance and the X is the wetland drainage. And we're seeing even at 30% drainage, we're seeing a decrease in bird abundance by half. So jumping to the annual discharge for the pothole till, it's a linear increase with wetland loss. Again, considering that interannual variability, that change is also considered larger. And this discharge was used to estimate nutrient loading. So some results for total phosphorus loading. So we use that basin outflow and a constant relationship between flow and concentration. And what we see, there's a nearly 200% increase in median annual TP loading from 0 to 100% wetland loss. That's what the figure is showing here on the right, wetland loss on the X and then total phosphorus annual loading on the Y. And we know that the contributing area is changing as Jiwa showed earlier. And that will be particularly important for phosphorus and nutrient loading in particular, but it's hard to estimate this small scale. So these are just some of the preliminary findings. It's a tool to provide us with much needed estimates of current and future change in these small basins. Mostly we saw discharge in average years are more severely impacted by drainage, water storage decreases as wetlands are lost, and nutrient loading increases with increasing flow as wetlands are lost. But the biggest impact was actually on wetland bird abundance. And this is likely underestimated because we're excluding obligate wetland species like ducks. So here we've integrated what we know across many different disciplines to create this tool to help us understand these effects and hopefully inform decision making. And with that, I'd like to thank you and I accept questions as possible. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Emily. And thanks to all of our speakers this morning. Really tough gig. We gave you only 10 minutes and you guys did a really nice job of presenting a lot of information for the audience in a short amount of time. Maren and Chris, perhaps I can turn it over to you to lead us into the next session.
Yeah, I was going to round up any unanswered questions in the Q&A, but there were just a couple and they've been answered, so there really isn't anything. Does anybody, before we move into our panel, have any questions for any of our speakers that they would like to ask? Hearing none, I'm just wondering if in the interest of time, we should move into our panel, especially since some have to leave early.
Sure, I can lead that off if that's okay, Maren.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So when Colin and Maren and I were asked to pull this session together, we wanted to use the opportunity to maybe have a bit of a conversation about how we could improve the mobilization of the kind of knowledge that you saw that the presentations today. So we invited a few people that we felt that had a diversity of experience in this field. For instance, Jane Elliott is a research scientist. I actually work with Jane. We're in the office together at Environment Canada in Saskatoon. Richard Gossens is with IISD, I believe, out of Winnipeg. Pamela Jossies with Ag Canada, and Corey White is with the Water Security Agency in Saskatchewan. And we've asked each of them to maybe speak for a couple minutes on their experiences, and we're kind of hoping that a discussion will flow from there. I might start with Corey, if that's okay.
Sure. There we go. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Really excited to see a whole bunch of the work that was presented already today. This stuff really drives some of our policy making processes. So just to give people a sense of I guess, one of the issues that I've been working on for the past few years, it is the drainage regulations and our approach to mitigation here in the province. So none of you would be surprised to know that drainage has been a part of the working landscape here for, probably over 100 years. So it presents itself as a really deeply ingrained issue with mounting science to suggest there's significant impacts. And so part of what we're being asked to do is to think about how Saskatchewan can approach this issue. So, after 2011 and 2014 flooding, there was a need that was highlighted, and we've been directed to, I guess, come up with some solutions. So we made some changes to our regulations in 2015 that empowered us to take a look at the impacts of flooding, water quality, and habitat associated with drainage. And so far, we've used the science to drive our approach so far. So having those impacts identified was based on our understanding of the current science. Understanding the drivers behind the impacts and those intervention points that we can manage have been an important part of how we're approaching things. We've also used information from our wetland inventory and delineation of ditches to understand how individuals have already organized themselves on the landscape, and that's informed what we call our network, which is our network approach, which is really a community, a local community scale. In terms of things I've seen today and linking it in with some of our approaches, when we're thinking about flooding, we need to understand both the relationship between flows and volumes and how that impacts, flooding on the landscape. Water quality, understanding how both concentration and load can drive water quality issues. A key part of our understanding that was really informative to our approach so far is understanding that dissolved phosphorus is the dominant form. That's been really key for us in terms of understanding what tools are effective management tools or could be effective management tools. And lastly, understanding some of the species response to habitat loss or degradation has been really important so far as well. We do acknowledge we have a lot more work to do, and I'm excited again to see some of this work go forward. So we know there's mounting science, and linking that into our policymaking is really important. Consolidating and synthesizing this science to drive what hydrological outcomes could look like, water quality outcomes and habitat outcomes could look like. At the end of the day, we need to take that information and provide it to our decision makers to make a decision on what outcomes we're looking for so that we can build the how. We're working on a number of projects right now, including some research and demonstration projects. We're looking at the agronomics, economics, nutrient management. However, I would point out that I think a core piece of this issue is the people component, and this represents a cultural change on the landscape. And underlying social drivers need to maybe have a little bit more focus placed on it so that we can develop the right fit approach for people. So I know that we're running out of time, so I'll just leave it at that. But science is really important. We're trying to integrate the two, but we definitely have a challenge in front of us.
Oh, that's awesome, Corey. Thanks. Some really good points made there. Richard, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. Yes, I'm a research scientist with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And it's really encouraging for me to see how things have really advanced. This is not something I just discovered today, but it just reaffirms it today is how the science is moving. We've come a long way in the last decade. We haven't come as far as we would like in the solutions part of it and solving the issues, but we've come a long way in understanding how things function across our landscape. And the communication and the networking of all the partners is also very encouraging because we all seem to be speaking a lot more the same language. That includes academia, that includes government, it includes local communities. So we've spent a lot of our time sort of working that area between government policy, science, academia. Traditionally, IISD was a policy think tank, sort of very high-level government policy institute, very internationally focused. So we've been around for a few decades, but over the last 10, 15 years, we've really evolved to become much more involved in local domestic issues. We've really created a place within the science community in Canada and North America. In 2014, we took on the Experimental Lakes area. So that's a research facility in northwestern Ontario. We took over operation and management of that facility in 2014, which really expanded our capacity for science. And we use that science, whether it's at ELA or whether it's across the prairies of understanding watersheds. And then we use that within our policy areas to help drive recommendations, help drive policy changes, which is really the key. The science is so important, and it's exciting to see where the science has taken us in understanding phosphorus management across the prairies, because it's resulted in a lot of management changes. So we've tried to lend our own assistance in guiding policy and understanding the science to help local watershed districts, local government organizations to help implement these changes. Water retention, better drainage practices, sustainable agriculture. These are all things that have really advanced in the last 10, 15 years. And so it's exciting to see that. And it's exciting to see where we can take that moving forward, especially with creation of the Canada Water Agency. We really look forward to seeing where that goes for us. So it's the communication, definitely, and the networking, the partnerships that really drive success. And we see that has really come a long way, and I can see it's going to be going even further. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Richard. That's awesome. Some really good points, and in some ways, sort of reiterating how Corey finished off about the importance of sort of that social component and partnerships. But Pamela, would you mind going next?
take the screen instead of take the floor. Sure. Hi, I'm Pamela Josie. Thanks for the invite. Always happy to get an update and hear what different students and people are working on. Just to give you a little background from where I'm coming from, I have degrees in natural resource management and land management from the University of Guelph. I've worked for the provincial government in Ontario for 10 years. That was with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and that was largely helping to fund nutrient management regulation research for regulation development. Then I moved to the Great Lakes and met a lot more water people, and moved to the federal government as well. And for the last 10 years, been with Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, and conducting my own research now on agricultural soil and nutrient management, particularly for Lake Erie, which you've heard about. And I'm involved in several bi-national and federal provincial governance committees. And some of the interesting work there is trying to set up an adaptive management framework for Lake Erie nutrient management. I was going to take a slightly different approach, so at a higher level than maybe what these guys, Corey and Richard had both mentioned already, but sort of the three takeaways I sort of want to highlight in terms of what I sort of see as key in trying to translate science into policy, because really the positions I've been in, that's really what we do. This morning's speakers, if you listen to the panel on science and policy, we're talking a lot about sort of influencing decision makers and the legislatures, and particularly elected officials. And I think you have to recognize that there's a lot of ways to influence behavior change, influence, make an impact, I guess, and make a difference. And the government, and when I say kind of decision makers, is kind of one level. And I guess through my history here, just wanted to relay that sometimes the government is the slowest way to do things. So if you want your science to have impact, the biggest thing is kind of knowing your audience. Because if it is a legislature, that 2-pager is probably great. Giving a briefing to them is what's needed, but there's a lot of in between, I guess I would say. A lot, depending what the organization or the institution uses, could be guidelines, standards, computer programs, maybe it's just seminars, meetings, position papers. Where can your work sort of plug in? What are listening to hear what that audience's key questions are? And often the questions aren't physical science questions. Around our nutrient management legislation, there was a lot of economic, legal, political questions being asked. And so part of the work as, I guess, sort of a bridge scientist or a knowledge broker was saying, the questions you're asking, need to be directed to a different kind of scientist, or are really going to not be able to be whittled down to a hypothesis in a testable way. So I think as there's, hearing the different models that are being used now, that's probably a bit different than the kinds of field work we were being asked to test. And so there's that intersection of which tools are going to answer the right questions. And what are the real questions, really honing in on questions. The second point was just translating science. So, I think as the policymakers and people trying to develop tools, the single paper and a single plain language summary is never enough. So there's always this process of resynthesizing, re-evaluating the body of work that's out there in light of new questions and new processes, things that are learned. And so really building that body of evidence and being part of that body of work, but also knowing your place in it too, over-promising what the science can provide without the full context. We see it right now in the public's view of science, that you hear one paper that says this and another that says another, and the decision makers are never sure. So that's the third point, I guess, was consensus building. And I think, you know, Corey and Richard both alluded to that, is bringing the different audiences and or different stakeholders together and trying to build a science consensus. There's sort of power struggles in some of this decision making and mistrust if people come from different states of knowing. And so I find this adaptive management framework in particular is one of the key things to a successful one we have learned along the way, is that, you know, you need to build a science consensus. So we're trying to build consensus statements around different processes in Lake Erie, and even just stating what is known for decision makers. It seems so obvious as scientists, you know, that, you know, this is what we're building off of, and we're discovering these new things. But, you know, having a consensus is a really on what is known is as important as a consensus on what still needs to be studied. So sorting those things out, giving some assurances to decision makers that they're going in the right direction. And that's a people process. And I think Corey mentioned that too, is that sort of we have the right fit, and Richard mentioned partnerships, building relationships. Don't need to build relationships with everybody, but being open to those who are asking the questions, and that your scale of work fits well. Staying in communication, and again, that understanding of what the needs are is really, really important. And that will just add, many voices give more strength to a statement or a study. And so again, some of these meta-analysis or putting existing work in a new paradigm. If something was done on sort of hourly or daily basis, but the tools and decision makers work on sort of monthly or seasonal things, how can you translate the very detailed work into something that's a little more generic, just so that is more usable? Because the other thing is we can often get lost in the detail. And patience. Timing is everything, and so knowing when your knowledge is really needed is important too. And unfortunately, the legislation regulation can be really slow, as I started at the beginning, and so something that Ag Canada is trying to do more of is having a more user-centered science approach. And you may have heard of our Living Laboratories initiative that's really intended to accelerate innovation and adoption. And going directly to end users who are decision makers of themselves, and not waiting for legislation or, you know, recommendations, but kind of building their own knowledge and testing things at the grassroots level, and letting those channels go to work. So it's the same keys of listening to the audience and being able to translate into words or a conceptual diagram or some kind of tool that they can use, but hopefully it's going to work a little faster. So I'll just stop there, but I'm interested to hear what others, any questions you may have.
Thanks, Pamela. That was great. There's a lot there that you, a lot of things to think about. But sorry, but maybe before we go to sort of a discussion or a question, if people want to put their thoughts or questions into the chat or the Q&A, we encourage them to do so. Our last panelist is Jane Elliott, and I was wondering if Jane would like to share a few things with us.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Pamela. I'm going to use my time to tell you about a recent workshop we held to bring together people from the agronomic and water quality communities to share perspectives and find common ground, sort of bridging the needs of environmental managers and agricultural producers. The Keeping Phosphorus on the Land workshop was the brainchild of Jian Liu, who spoke previously. Along with Helen Walsh and myself, he obtained seed funding to host the workshop through a capacity building award. We had hoped to have an in-person workshop to build trust, but as with everything else, we had to settle for a virtual format. But one thing that we really wanted to avoid was hosting a water quality meeting focused on agriculture. We wanted to have a kind of true sharing of ideas, not just a water quality speaker at an ag conference or an ag speaker at a water meeting. We planned for a small group of around 50 to keep everyone engaged. And our first step was to form an advisory committee. We engaged researchers and extension specialists from the 3 Prairie provinces and a representative from a national industry body. All of our advisory committee were familiar with both crop production and water quality issues. Although some of our meetings were a bit like herding cats, eventually we were able to agree on a format, an agenda, and an invitee list. With only 50 people, we were quite restricted, and we kind of concentrated on people who were influential in their area of expertise. And we did end up with the kind of mix of representation that we'd hoped for. Approximately 50% from agriculture, 50% from water quality, and probably about half to 3/4 had some experience of working in both areas. Approximately 1/3 of our representatives were from university, 1/3 from government, both federal and provincial, and 1/3 from industry. The workshop was held over 2 half days that were 1 week apart, which gave us time to do some planning for the second day. It occurred in late February, early March, and had quite a narrow focus of soil test phosphorus. And we did this to make sure that we dealt with the subject in quite a bit of depth and were able to really share the different perspectives. So for day 1, we started with a kind of state of the science session, pretty typical, covering soil phosphorus management from both agronomic and water quality perspectives, with 5 fairly short talks from acknowledged experts, mostly researchers. And that was followed by a facilitated discussion among the speakers. We had held a pre-conference meeting of the speakers to make sure that we reduced potential for overlap between their talks. And that resulted in a wonderful discussion between the speakers that we were able to kind of partially recreate in the speaker panel. So after this speaker panel, we assigned our participants to breakout rooms where they discussed the dilemma of picking phosphorus fertilizer application rates. And the results of those breakout sessions were synthesized along with a feedback survey from day 1 to form the start of day 2 and also the basis of group discussions on day 2. So the main event on day 2 was an industry session with panelists that included a company agronomist, an independent crop consultant, a provincial ag extension specialist, a water quality specialist, and an agricultural industry rep. And this was very helpful, I think, because it provided insights to the water people in the room into how best to communicate with producers, where do producers get their advice, and what are producers' motivations. We did a World Cafe approach for the breakouts in the second day, and it was fairly successful. We had the facilitators and the rapporteurs move from room to room, taking their questions with them. As I mentioned, the questions were formulated based on what we heard on day 1. And we were really aiming to get participants to map out a way ahead, to look at pathways to improve soil P management on the prairies. The questions we posed included research knowledge gaps, the relevance of current guidelines and recommendations, next steps beyond soil P management, and especially communication strategies. Was it successful? Well, our participants responded favorably to our exit survey. We thought that the exchange of perspectives went really well, and we have formed some new working relationships. One thing we found out was that crop consultants are the key people to engage in communication with producers. And partly in response to that, we're forming a new working group community of practice, including industry advisors. And we're going to convene this in the fall to look at the next steps from both a research and communications point of view. And this group will move forward on the list of opportunities that we compiled as a result of the workshop. And finally, we have actually created 2 new research teams that have already submitted proposals to investigate some of the potentially mutually beneficial phosphorus management strategies that came out from the workshop. So thanks for teeing me up for that, Pamela, because I think that was the sort of engagement you were talking about. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. That was actually completely fortuitous, that order.
Well, and it sounds like that was very much like some nitrogen and phosphorus forums we had in Ontario at different times. It can be very successful.
I guess I've got lots of questions and things that I could pose to everybody. I think Jane's example is a really good one of some of the things that Richard and Pamela and Corey were speaking about. I'm not sure if there's a.
I also see that there's a question in the Q&A, Chris.
Yeah, I just found that. Well, okay, maybe I'll just read this out and maybe get some feedback on Jane or Pamela's. Murray asks is that I guess he's getting at this idea that farmers don't always connect the application of phosphorus on the land to algal blooms in downstream lakes. So and then there's another one is the challenge to groups like GWF or the people producing the research. Is it a difference in values between what the research is looking at and what the farmers value? And that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Figure out how to put that into a question. But anyway, maybe Pamela, if you want to jump in there, just go to town.
Yeah, no, I think they've sort of there is a disconnect potentially, and I know we experience that in Ontario a lot. But there's just like there's different people, there's different farmers, and so the challenge always is that different farmers have different values. Some of them are very big system thinkers and see the connections from their land, to the watershed, to a lake, kind of see their land in a landscape. And there's other farmers that are very focused on, this is a recipe I follow every year. It's, I need to just do this so I can get on to looking after my animals or put my kids to college, right? So it's a people issue, but I don't think it's any more. It's recognizing it's not a black box agriculture and trying to a variety. I think the diversity is there, and so I think just having a diversity of approaches that some things are going to work in some situations, and other ones we just have to keep trying new things. There's a distribution out there, and trying to understand that distribution and where you get the majority is good. But I think there's always going to be this challenge of it's different people value different things. It's not just that farmers have a block value of this, but it is businesses, which brings in a different aspect to the decision making, I guess.
Yeah, that's thanks for that point, Murray, and the response
Yeah.
Pamela.
Can I chip in?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think what we've found is that farmers generally want to do the right thing. They might not be completely sure what that is. And we maybe need to do a bit better job of communicating that message and looking for pathways to communicate that message. But the other aspect of that is that we can't ask them to sacrifice their livelihoods in order to do what's going to be best for water. So I think part of the good things that came out of our workshop was to look at things that potentially make good economic sense and also probably make very good water quality sense. And we were able to identify a few things like that. But I think if we go any further and look for things that are purely for water quality, we have to look at some kind of mechanism to support the farmer to do those things.
I can add as well. I definitely agree. Some of the best success that we've had for sure is working from the bottom up, is working at the producer level. We work a lot. We spend a lot of time working with the local watershed districts because those are the people that are on the front line, so to speak, on the ground, working with producers. You know, they know the producers, they know the communities, they know that they get to understand their watersheds and the issues that are out there. And it's really addressing the producers' concerns. And definitely for sure, you can't just lay like some decision on farmers and say you have to do this. You need their buy-in, you need their support. They need to see the reason why they're doing it. And having more programs now in Manitoba, we've been blessed with some amazing funding programs now. The Manitoba government brought in their new trust programs, the Conservation Trust, the Grow Trust. And this is money where this money has been invested. And so every year there's this money available for watershed programs and projects. And really the focus is on these on the ground projects that benefit farmers. And so programs like ALICE, this is sort of a traditional type of ALICE, if you're familiar with ALICE, ALUS, Alternative Land Use Services, where they pay the producers for the value of the benefits that the land is getting when you put it out of production. So those are the types of things that you need to get the producers buy-in. And I have to say the Living Labs program is a brilliant process. It's created at the bottom up. It's at the producer level, engaging the producers, getting them involved on the landscape in understanding their properties, best management practices that work, and having their buy-in and support. So that is so key and critical. Is communicating the science is important, but communicating with the producers and talking to the producers is even more important.
Thanks, Richard. I think this co-development idea and maybe that's not the right word, but that Living Labs kind of encapsulates is maybe a way to go for the future. We've got about 5 minutes left, and there've been a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to pose to the panelists if they could try to squeeze this in and if I get it out fast enough. Somebody, I think Haley was asking how we kind of promote this cultural change that you guys were speaking about, the sort of bridging of ideas. And then somebody asked if you had like top 2 wishes for how you'd like to see management advanced with respect to water quality and other ecosystem services and landscapes. What would that? Maybe I'll pin you down to your top wish because we have time. But what's the top suggestion that you have? Maybe we'll do this backward. Richard, you're already on the screen, so we'll go Richard, Jane, and Pam, please.
Sure. Something that we've been really trying to advocate for, and we're trying to really work towards, is having decision makers, whether it's local governments, watershed districts, provincial governments, having things like natural infrastructure, so nature-based solutions, naturalized systems having those as part of their decision-making package, instead of defaulting to built infrastructure, gray infrastructure that they're familiar with, contracts for snow plows or building a wastewater lagoon. For them to have the understanding of naturalized ecosystems, working landscapes in their package, in their portfolio, that would be amazing. So then they actually default to those types of systems and management strategies.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. Jane?
That's a really tough one. I'm just reading the question again. One thing that coming from this workshop, something I would really like to be able to do is work together again so that we can have those face-to-face meetings and the kind of trust building that comes with that. It's a lot more difficult to get that sort of thing going virtually. And I'm really looking forward to this fall when we can pull a community of practice together and maybe actually meet up and get to know one another and delve a little bit deeper into motivations and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I'm with you there, Jane. Pamela, maybe we'll just go to you and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. I kind of want the super tool, the super model that would enable it to be geolocated in a field and sort of say, find me here and I want to grow. This is what kind of farmer I am. And so you say, okay, if I'm going to grow, corn and soy here, what does that mean for water quality? What does that mean for carbon? What does that mean to do biodiversity? And have something that would say, if I did it this way versus that way, adopting a new BMP, it's going to benefit, Lake Erie this much. It's going to benefit soil carbon this much. There's opportunities to get money doing these different things, right? Because right now those ecological benefits aren't, and the broader benefits than just your own field aren't part of that decision-making process. So it's the same thing, I think Rich was saying, bring these other things into the decision-making process, because unless they're sort of on an equal playing field and at that moment when you're making that decision, it's not able to be considered so as easily anyway. And so just getting into that mode of it's just part of the decision-making and having a tool to help.
That's great. Thanks, Pamela. Yeah, we're actually a little bit over time, but I think the conversation is really good. But we do need to wrap up. I just want to check in with Maren and Colin and see if they've got anything else.
I could talk about this stuff with you guys all day, but I recognize that the plenary panel 2 is starting at 3:15 if people are hoping to attend. So as much as I would love to keep going, I don't think that we can.
Good.
Yeah, I would just echo that and say that I've really enjoyed the conversation, the questions that people have posed to our panel, and the panel taking some time out of your day to come join this and provide us with your thoughts and provoke hopefully us to do better in various ways using some of the ideas you've shared today. So it's been great, and yeah, regrettably we can't go on longer.